There are certain moments in life that arrive with no warning and still somehow feel like they have been coming for years. For me, that moment happened beneath warm string lights, in a rented event hall filled with white roses, soft music, and the kind of polite laughter people use when they believe they are witnessing a happy family celebration. It was supposed to be a beautiful evening. My stepson, Evan Carter, had just gotten engaged to a lovely young woman named Sophie. My husband, Mark, wanted to host a formal dinner for both families, something elegant and memorable. He said it should feel special. He said it should feel like the beginning of a new chapter. So I made sure it did. I handled the guest list, the menu, the seating chart, the florist, the bakery, the rental company, and every tiny detail that no one notices unless it goes wrong. I chose Sophie's favorite vanilla bean cake because she once casually mentioned she preferred simple desserts over rich chocolate. I remembered that. I always remembered the little things. I pressed every linen napkin myself because the catering company had sent over wrinkled ones, and I couldn't stand the thought of the night looking careless. And if I'm being honest, I wanted it to be perfect for a reason I did not fully admit to myself at the time. I think some part of me was still hoping that if I loved this family hard enough, long enough, quietly enough, one day I would finally belong to it in a way no one could deny. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. That night, the room was full. There were nearly 50 people there between our side of the family, Sophie's family, old neighbors, co-workers, and a few of Evan's college friends. The candles were lit. The dinner had gone smoothly. The speeches had started. And for one brief hour, I almost let myself believe we had made it. Mark stood near the center of the room with his champagne glass raised, giving the kind of speech he had always been good at giving. Warm, polished, emotional in a measured way. He talked about how proud he was of Evan. He talked about love and resilience and how beautiful it was to see his son starting a life with someone as kind as Sophie. He even mentioned Evan's late mother, Claire, and how proud she would have been to see him standing there. Then, almost as an afterthought, Mark smiled in my direction and said, "And of course, thank you to Lauren for helping put this evening together." That was it. 12 years of marriage, 14 years of loving that family, countless private sacrifices. All of it compressed into one quick line at the tail end of someone else's speech. I would have swallowed it the way I had swallowed so many things before. I had practice. I had spent years learning how to be grateful for scraps and call it peace. But then Evan laughed. Not a joyful laugh, not a nervous one either. It was the kind of laugh that carries something mean inside it. He lifted his glass and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Let's not act like Lauren built this family. She just married into it." The room went still. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the musicians near the corner stopped shuffling their sheet music. Evan looked straight at me, and there was a sharpness in his face I had seen before, though never quite so openly. "No offense," he added, smiling in that cruel way people smile when they know exactly what they are doing. "But you were never really part of this family the way my mom was, and you never will be." Sophie's face went white. I saw her hand tighten around the stem of her glass. I saw Claire's sister, Janice, sitting at the far side of the table, not looking shocked at all. I saw Mark open his mouth, ready perhaps to say something, then close it again the way he had done so many times before whenever courage was required and the truth carried a cost. That silence told me everything. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask Evan how he could say such a thing after everything I had done for him. I had lived too long in that house not to understand the danger of saying the true thing too early. Instead, I set my fork down neatly beside my plate and looked first at Evan, then at Mark, and I said, very calmly, "That's fine. Then, from this moment on, your father can carry what I've been carrying." Mark went pale. Not confused, not angry, pale. Because unlike everyone else in that room, he knew exactly what I meant. I stood up, thanked Sophie's parents for the dinner, picked up my purse, and walked out before anyone could stop me. Behind me, the room remained frozen in that strained, brittle silence families mistake for dignity when they are really standing in the middle of a collapse. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the office of Daniel Reeves, my attorney and financial advisor for almost 2 decades. His office was closed, but he had given me after-hours access years earlier when we first started managing the trust my parents had left me. He used to say that the hardest decisions in life rarely happen between 9 and 5. That night, he was right. I unlocked the side door, turned on the lamp in the conference room, and sat alone at the long walnut table with my purse still clutched in my lap. In that quiet room, with no guests to perform for and no family tension to carefully tiptoe around, I let myself tell the truth in full. I had not merely helped raise Evan, I had funded his life. When I married Mark, he was a decent man trying to recover from a devastating loss. Claire had died after a long illness, and by the time I met him, he was exhausted in ways he did not have language for. Evan was 14 then, grieving, angry, watchful, and old enough to remember every detail of the life that had been taken from him. I never tried to replace his mother. I need to say that plainly, because women like me are so often accused of exactly that. I never asked him to call me Mom. I never moved Claire's photographs. I never entered that house believing love could erase grief. What I tried to do was smaller and, in some ways, harder. I tried to be steady. I made sure there were groceries in the refrigerator, clean towels in the hallway closet, and someone sitting in the audience at Evan's basketball games. I learned which pasta sauce he liked and which subjects made him anxious. I kept extra cash in the kitchen drawer for school trips and lunch money. I listened when he wanted to talk and stayed quiet when he didn't. What Evan did not know, and what almost no one in our family knew, was how often my role went far beyond emotional labor. Mark worked hard, but his salary was stretched thin. Claire's medical bills had hollowed him out financially. He had pride, though, and pride is a strange thing. It will let a man accept help privately while still needing the world to believe he did it all himself. The first time I stepped in was during Evan's sophomore year of high school. He had been accepted into a prestigious summer engineering program out of state, something that could open serious doors for him later. The tuition, travel, and housing costs were more than Mark could manage. I still remember finding him late one night in the kitchen, staring at the paperwork with that look people wear when shame and panic are trying not to show on their face. I told him I would handle it. He resisted for about 30 seconds, and then relief won. I paid the full amount the next morning. Evan went. He thrived. He came back glowing with confidence, already talking about college applications and internships and a future that suddenly felt much bigger than the one he had been imagining. He thanked his father. Mark let him. That became the pattern. When Evan needed SAT tutoring, I paid for it. When he wanted campus visits across 3 states, I booked the flights and hotels and let Mark present the trip as something we figured out. When Evan broke his wrist and the specialist was out of network, I covered the bill. When his dorm fees increased unexpectedly during his second year of college, I wired the money quietly before the due date. When he lost a laptop the week before finals, I replaced it overnight and told Mark to say it had come from a work bonus. There was always a reason for the secrecy, always an excuse that sounded temporary. He's already under stress. I'll tell him after graduation. This isn't the right time. He still sees me as the one holding things together. Let me explain it when he's older. Older came and went. Truth kept getting delayed. And because truth was delayed, resentment had room to grow. Evan saw me as comfortable, polished, unnecessary. The woman who appeared after the hard years were over. The second wife who benefited from a life built by other people's struggle. He did not see the checks, the transfers, the conversations with bankers, the late-night budget restructuring, the tax decisions, the private compromises. He did not know that when Mark's small contracting business nearly collapsed under debt, I was the one who kept it from taking the house with it. He did not know that the family savings his father occasionally mentioned was largely an account built from my inheritance and my consulting income. I never demanded credit. That part is true. But I did ask for honesty. Over and over again, I asked for honesty. And over again, Mark chose comfort instead. By the time Daniel arrived that night, he had seen my car in the parking lot and come back from home in jeans and a blazer. My mind was made up. I want every discretionary transfer stopped, I told him. He sat across from me quietly, listening the way professionals do when they know this is no longer merely a financial matter. All of it? He asked. All of it, I said. The education support, the insurance supplements, the revolving debt coverage, the mortgage cushion, the emergency reserve tied to Mark's business liabilities. I want everything untangled. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Are you certain? Yes. I was more certain than I had been in years, because what happened that night was not a rude comment from a spoiled young man. It was the final result of a lie that had been nurtured for over a decade. And if Mark wanted the image of being the sole protector of his son, then for once, he would have to live inside that image without my invisible scaffolding holding it up. The changes were not dramatic at first. That is the nature of hidden systems. When they fail, they do not collapse all at once. They begin quietly, with little cracks no one notices until they form a pattern. For the first week, nothing seemed different. Mark and I moved around each other carefully, almost politely. He made coffee in the mornings. I answered work emails. We discussed grocery needs and dry cleaning, and whether the air conditioning filter needed changing. We never once mentioned the dinner, but I could feel him waiting. He was waiting for me to soften, to reconsider, to say, perhaps I had overreacted, and everything could go back to normal if we both just pretended hard enough. Then the first call came. Evan had an issue with his graduate school loan payment. A transfer he had quietly relied on every month was no longer arriving. Mark told him it must be a bank error. He said he would take care of it. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for nearly 20 minutes without moving. 2 days later, Evan's car insurance was flagged for non-payment. Then a dental installment. Then an apartment guarantor fee. Then the credit card balance he thought was under control suddenly began accumulating interest because the supplemental payment system had stopped. Each time he called Mark. Each time, Mark scrambled. I watched him cash out savings, borrow against small investments, and once even ask a coworker about a short-term personal loan. Still, he said nothing. Still, he did not tell Evan the truth. That was perhaps the hardest part for me to witness. Not that Mark was struggling, but that even then, even with the structure visibly failing around him, he would rather manufacture confusion than admit what had actually been happening all these years. Sophie noticed before anyone else did. She was observant in that quiet, intelligent way that often gets underestimated because it doesn't announce itself loudly. She saw that Evan was becoming tense after calls with his father. She saw that Mark had started arriving at family dinners distracted and brittle. She saw numbers being mentioned in vague half-sentences and questions being answered too quickly. One afternoon, she texted me a simple message. "Would you have time for coffee this week? Just you and me?" I stared at that message longer than I expected to. I had always liked Sophie. She was thoughtful, grounded, and far kinder than this family deserved. More importantly, she had never once treated me like an outsider. She was the first person in years who asked me ordinary, human questions about myself, rather than only speaking to me in my role as wife, host, organizer, or support system. So I said yes. We met at a small cafe on Maple Avenue on a Thursday evening just before sunset. She looked nervous when she arrived, like someone carrying a question too heavy to ask casually. After we ordered, she folded her hands around her cup and said, "I think there's something going on financially in this family that no one is telling me. And I don't want details that aren't my business, but I do need to know whether I'm marrying into confusion or into dishonesty." That sentence made me look at her in a completely new way. Most people ask for reassurance. Sophie asked for truth. So I gave it to her. Not all at once, not dramatically. I did not unload years of pain onto a 24-year-old woman over coffee. I simply asked her one question. "If I show you the full picture," I said, "are you prepared to actually see it?" She nodded. The next evening, she came to my house. Mark was at his weekly poker night, and the place was quiet. I had already taken a thick folder from my home office and placed it on the dining table. It contained everything: account summaries, tuition invoices, transfer confirmations, medical reimbursements, insurance supplements, property tax coverage, business debt restructuring documents, emergency payments, notes from meetings with Daniel, years of records, organized chronologically. Nothing theatrical, just facts. Sophie went through the folder slowly. At first, she looked confused, then focused, then increasingly still. I watched her face change as one year connected to another, as one payment explained the next, as one hidden support system revealed itself not as a few isolated acts of generosity, but as an entire financial foundation running beneath the family she thought she understood. Finally, she looked up at me and her eyes were wet. "He didn't know?" she asked. "No," I said. "He never knew. Your fiancé has spent most of his life believing his father carried him alone." "And Mark let him believe that?" "Yes." She looked back down at the papers. Why? It was the simplest question in the world, and still the one that had governed the last decade of my life. "Because your father-in-law wanted to be admired more than he wanted to be honest," I said gently. "And because I let compassion for his grief turn into permission for his silence." That night, Sophie did not rush to defend Evan, or Mark, or me. She did something far more rare. She sat with the truth. Before leaving, she asked me one more thing. "What do you want from this?" It took me a moment to answer because, for years, I had been trained to want very little. "Not gratitude," I said. "Never gratitude. I want accuracy. I want the people in this family to stop telling a story that requires me to disappear." 3 weeks later, Sophie's parents hosted a formal pre-wedding dinner at their home. I almost didn't go. Mark and I were still living in the same house, but something essential between us had cracked. Not loudly, not violently, just permanently. He had started sleeping badly. I had started feeling calm in a way that scared him. Calm can be more final than anger. But I went, because avoiding the room would have meant returning to the role I had finally stepped out of. The role of the woman who protects everyone else from discomfort by swallowing her own reality whole. The dinner was elegant. Sophie's mother had arranged long white candles down the table, and there was a soft jazz trio near the garden doors. Janice was there, of course, carrying that familiar expression of polite tolerance she had worn around me for years. Evan looked better than he had in weeks, though tired around the eyes. Mark looked like a man waiting for a verdict. When the time came for speeches, he stood. Of course he did. He spoke about family, endurance, love, beginnings. He spoke about Claire. He spoke about parenthood. And then he said a sentence I had heard some version of for years. Everything we built for Evan, we built together. I kept my eyes on my plate. I didn't challenge him. I didn't correct him. That season of my life was over. And then Sophie stood up. She did it with a steadiness that changed the temperature of the room before she had even spoken. She thanked everyone for being there. She said that before marrying into a family, she believed in understanding its history clearly. Then she walked to a side table near the fireplace, opened her laptop, and turned on a projector her father had apparently helped her set up earlier. The first image on the wall was a single word: foundation. The second was a tuition statement from Evan's college years. The third, an insurance payment. The fourth, a debt settlement. The fifth, a property tax receipt. She said very little. She did not accuse. She did not perform outrage. She simply moved through the documents one by one, letting the pattern emerge on its own. At first, no one understood. Then the room began to understand all at once. Every document ended the same way. Paid from the Mitchell Trust. Authorized by Lauren Mitchell. Source account, L. Mitchell Holdings. Evan stared at the wall like he had stopped recognizing his own life. Mark did not move at all. Janice shifted in her chair and tried once to speak, something about not knowing the whole context, but Sophie, in the gentlest voice I have ever heard cut through denial, said, "Then let's hear the whole context now." No one answered. Finally, Sophie turned toward Mark and asked the only question that mattered. Why did no one ever tell the truth? Mark sat down slowly. For a moment, I thought he might avoid it again. I thought he might reach for another vague phrase: family matters, complicated finances, shared decisions. But perhaps something about seeing those years projected in black and white, with witnesses, stripped him of the language he usually hid behind. His voice broke when he spoke. "Because I was afraid," he said. The room stayed still. "I was afraid that if Evan knew how much Lauren had done, how much I hadn't done, he would stop seeing me as the one who held him up after his mother died. I was afraid he would look at me and see what I couldn't provide, and I couldn't bear that." It was the most honest thing he had said in years. Not noble, not sufficient, but honest. Evan's face changed in a way I will never forget. He looked first at his father, then at the wall of evidence, and then finally at me. There was no anger in his face anymore, only collapse. He stood up so suddenly his chair scraped hard against the floor. For 1 second, I braced myself. Old instincts, old wounds. But instead of lashing out, he walked toward me and stopped beside my chair. His eyes were full, his mouth slightly open, as though he had arrived at a language he had never learned to speak. He began, and then nothing. No defense, no explanation, no excuse. For the first time in all the years I had known him, my stepson had nothing to hide behind. Not youth, not grief, not misinformation, not inherited loyalty. Only truth. He left the room after that, not dramatically, just quietly, as if he needed walls and air and distance from every version of his life that had just shattered at once. People imagine truth like lightning, as though once it strikes, everything is suddenly illuminated and transformed. That is not how it works. Truth is slower. It rearranges people. It asks them to live afterward with what they now know. The months that followed were not easy. Mark started therapy. I will give him that. I did not ask him to. He found a counselor on his own and began going weekly. He came home quieter after those sessions, stripped down in a way I had never seen before. One evening, he sat across from me at our kitchen table and said, "I thought silence was protecting my son, but it was protecting my image of myself." That mattered. Not because it fixed anything, it didn't, but because for the first time, he was naming the betrayal accurately. I didn't rush to forgive him. Some wounds deserve honesty before they deserve healing, and I had spent too many years prioritizing his comfort over my clarity. Evan changed too, though more quietly. He sold the luxury SUV he had been driving and replaced it with something practical and fully paid off. He picked up part-time consulting work on weekends. He restructured his own debts. He began paying his own insurance, his own loan supplements, his own real adult expenses, with a seriousness I had never seen in him before. But the most meaningful change was smaller than all of that. Every Saturday morning, he started coming by the house. At first, it was awkward, painfully awkward. He would arrive with coffee, stand at the door for a second too long, and ask if it was a bad time. We would sit in the kitchen and talk about ordinary things, the weather, work, what Sophie was planning for the wedding, whether the neighbor's dog had finally stopped digging under the fence. Those first conversations were stiff because we were not repairing an argument. We were building a relationship that, in many ways, had never been given a truthful chance to exist. Over time, though, something softened. He asked about my childhood, my parents, my work, the cities I had lived in before marrying Mark, the books I liked, the kind of music I played when I cooked. Things a son might ask a woman who had always been part of his life, if only he had allowed himself to see her that way. One Saturday, about 4 months after the dinner at Sophie's parents' house, he sat quietly for so long I thought perhaps he had changed his mind about speaking. Then he said, "I spent years being loyal to a story instead of a person." I looked up from my coffee. He swallowed hard and continued, "I thought honoring my mom meant keeping you outside the circle. I didn't understand that those two things had nothing to do with each other." There are apologies that sound polished and correct, and then there are apologies that sound like someone finally laying down a weapon they have been carrying too long. That one was real. "You never had to choose between loving your mother and respecting me," I said. He nodded slowly. "I know that now." It did not erase the past, but it changed the future. When the wedding came the following spring, I was prepared to attend quietly and leave quietly. I wore a navy dress, sat near the front, and told myself I expected nothing. Sophie looked radiant. Mark looked older than he had a year earlier. Janice, to my surprise, was civil in a way that bordered on humbled. At the reception, after the cake had been cut and the first dances were over, Evan stood to give a speech. I felt every muscle in my body tense. Old memories do that. They teach you to brace even when the room is different. He began with Sophie, thanking her for her patience, her steadiness, and the courage it had taken to ask hard questions at the exact moment everyone else preferred easy lies. Then he turned toward me. "There's someone else I need to thank," he said. The room became very quiet. For years, the strongest parent in my life was the one I understood the least. She never asked me to call her mom. She never demanded attention. She never held her sacrifices over my head. She just kept showing up. For school, for emergencies, for bills I never knew existed, for moments I didn't even realize had been saved for me. My vision blurred. "I confused silence with absence," he said. "And I confused love with what was loudest in the room. I know better now." I cried then. Not the kind of crying that comes from humiliation or fresh pain. The quieter kind. The kind that comes when something buried is finally seen in the light and allowed to exist without apology. Mark reached for my hand under the table. This time, I let him. Not because everything had been repaired, not because years of invisibility can be undone by one speech, but because truth had finally entered the room and stayed there. I think often about women like me, women who marry into unfinished grief, women who become caretakers without titles, women who hold families together with money, labor, memory, planning, softness, endurance, and 1,000 invisible acts no one documents because everyone quietly assumes they will keep doing them forever. And I think the most dangerous thing that can happen to a woman like that is not that she gives too much. It is that everyone around her begins to treat what she gives as natural law, as though the meals cook themselves, as though the bills resolve themselves, as though children arrive safely into adulthood by momentum alone, as though emotional steadiness costs nothing, as though love that does not announce itself is somehow worth less than love that makes speeches. It isn't. If my story means anything now, it is this. Love does not require applause to be real, but respect should never be optional. Not in a marriage, not in a family, not in any room where a woman has spent years carrying what everyone else was too comfortable to notice. I did not need to replace Claire. I never wanted to. I only wanted the truth to have room enough for all of us. For the boy who lost his mother, for the man who feared being seen as less than heroic, for the young woman brave enough to stop a lie before marrying into it. And yes, for me too, the woman who stood in the background so long that people mistook her silence for insignificance. These days, Evan still comes by on Saturdays. Sometimes Sophie comes with him, and the three of us sit in the kitchen drinking coffee while the sunlight hits the counter just right. Sometimes we talk about wedding plans, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing important at all. And maybe that is the real miracle, not the grand reveal, not the public confession, not even the apology. Maybe the miracle is that once the truth was finally spoken, ordinary life became possible in a way it never had been before. No performance, no hidden ledger, no private translation of every family moment, just clarity and peace built honestly at last. If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories.